Welcome, I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel. Today we'll talk about Jupiter's journey through 2022 and what a journey it is. First off, I wanted to say thank you to all of my patrons. I appreciate all of your support. If you would like to get access to videos early, whether astrology videos, magic videos, or both, as well as access to content that's not available to the general public, and at the higher tiers, access to my magical elections document, which lists out the most auspicious dates every month for making your astrological talismans, just go to patreon.com/Nina Griffin. All right, now let's get started. So Jupiter's journey took me a while to put together. And the reason is that Jupiter is doing a lot this year. And so I had to keep researching a lot of what Jupiter had done in the past to better understand how it might act this year. But also I wanted to keep this video reasonably succinct and not 4 hours long. So this is going to be a very intense, very information-dense video. If you want to get like a pen and paper or take notes in some way because you're interested, this is probably a good time to do that. I'll wait. Now, the first thing I wanted to talk about is just a general sense of Jupiter's journey this year, just to kind of give you that really, really high-level view. I think it's important to realize that this is going to be a year of fast-paced change due to the number of sign changes by Jupiter, combined with other astronomical events that will involve Jupiter. Some of these events are more common, some of them are more rare, but if you put it all together, it really adds up to a very busy zigzag kind of journey that Jupiter takes us on. I think in many ways, it's going to feel like a year of whiplash, in some ways not unlike 2021, where you might start the year with one expectation, and then that expectation may be subverted, and then it's going to be subverted again. And that feeling especially, I think, picks up the pace in the last quarter of 2022. So even though we'll feel that way a little bit like you're driving along a very windy road with a new vista at every turn, it's going to feel like a super zigzag mountain road, especially in that fourth quarter of 2022. Now, the one nice thing about Jupiter doing so much this year is that he gets to bring his energy of liberation and freedom to different spheres of existence. And I'll explain a little bit more about how that might manifest toward the end of the video once you've had a chance to kind of assimilate all of the information. So the important events in 2022 that impact Jupiter are as follows. These are, again, the high-level things. One are going to be the sign changes from Pisces to Aries and then back again. Of course, he's going to be retrograde for about 4 months as usual, between the degrees of 8 Aries and 28 Pisces. He's going to make a few key aspects as well that will color the kind of journey he's going to have. We'll talk a little bit about his synodic cycle, in other words, the Jupiter-Sun cycle, which is always very important. And then finally, we'll mention the eclipse that really seems to highlight Jupiter in 2022. So first, let's talk about Jupiter's sign changes. So currently, now in early January 2022, he is in Pisces, and he will move into Aries May 10th. He will then retrograde into Pisces for about 2 months, October 27th through December 20th, at which point he will return to Aries. So in total, Jupiter will spend approximately 6 months in Pisces this year, and 6 months in Aries, but not in 2 chunks, but in smaller installments, which is going to give us that sense of constant change and vertigo. Now, Jupiter will change signs 3 times this year, which is about the maximum that you see in a calendar year. In 2020, as a contrast and comparison, Jupiter only changed signs once. So 3 changes by Jupiter predict a lot of back and forth and situations that are in flux. I think that this year, wanting permanent and unchanging resolution once and for all is not going to happen, and I think will only lead to frustration. It's much better to stay flexible and anticipate that things will change. I think that, especially in the pandemic world, this can feel very frustrating and somewhat similar to 2021, which was, by the way, another year with 3 sign changes by Jupiter. Where we think that things are going to be one way and make plans for that as the new steady state, but then Jupiter changes signs and suddenly the situation has shifted again. So my advice on a practical level this year is to make refundable reservations at every turn. Now, Jupiter in Pisces, as we've already experienced in 2021 and the beginning of 2022, is spiritual, it's mystical, it's romantic, And as I've mentioned before, it can create major rose-colored glasses where people discount the facts in favor of what they want to believe. Jupiter in any of the signs and any of the planets in any sign have their good side and bad side. The question is, which one do we focus on, right? Where do we live out our existence at what level? In terms of weather, because Jupiter is very important for the weather, Jupiter in Pisces, which is a cold and wet sign, will support that cooler and rainier weather, which is a blessing in some places and a curse in others. Certainly, I think flooding and heavy rains are going to be more likely this winter and spring until he moves into Aries, basically, as well as in November and December of this year when he's going to be in Pisces. It is a very plentiful and fertile sign for crops and especially fish. So I'm curious to know if fish and maybe even crustaceans are going to be a little bit less expensive this year. What's interesting, though, when you look at the traditional sources where they talk about Jupiter's effect on the weather, they like to say that Jupiter in Pisces creates healthful air. And this is a statement which is very interesting and it's easily overlooked by us modern readers. But in fact, it tends to refer to epidemic diseases becoming less prevalent during that time. It was thought that epidemics like the plague were caused by unhealthful air. And it's not entirely wrong in that germs are often spread through the air, as for example, COVID. But in Jupiter in Pisces, there's the sense that the air becomes healthier. So I wonder if this is a somewhat better year for the pandemic. I am not ready to declare it fully over everywhere, but it certainly seems like it could be a positive moment in terms of public health as well as, respiratory health. Now, Jupiter in Pisces does tend to show a year in which religious and spiritual movements are going to thrive and be front and center. The best manifestation of that is a focus on universal personhood and compassion toward others who are suffering. The worst manifestation is cultish behavior and theocratic oppression. All of those could be possible depending on where in the world we are. But this is just, again, two sides of the same coin of Jupiter in Pisces. Jupiter in Aries, by contrast, is going to be a really major change. He goes from a sign of a benefic into a sign ruled by a malefic and the exaltation of the sun. Now, Jupiter does lose dignity. He is the domicile lord in Pisces, so he's very comfortable there. And he's only the nocturnal triplicity ruler of Aries. He also has some minor dignities here and there in Aries. But it is something to recognize. We have to know that Jupiter, while he's not unhelpful in Aries, he doesn't quite have that same characteristic all-around benevolence that just wants to love everyone, which is so Jupiter in Pisces. Jupiter in Aries in particular speaks to the powerful. So Jupiter in Aries particularly speaks to the powerful people in society, as historically, the fiery triplicity, which Aries is a part of, referred to the warrior class who usually ruled the country. So Aries in particular, being the exaltation of the sun, has a very strong connection to royalty. So Jupiter's condition this year will have a very particular effect on people in charge at the highest levels of prominence and visibility. Now, military activity can also increase at this time, although there are very specific ways this happened in previous years, and I'll talk about that soon. Since Jupiter in a Mars sign brings energy and optimism to martial activities. On the one hand, it can certainly increase a certain optimism that brings people to war because they think they're likely to win. On the other hand, it tends to often bring a resolution to warlike activities if they started previously. It's certainly a very assertive Jupiter compared to any that we've seen in the past few years. So I think that this placement could be used to benefit others as well as bring just very energetic foolishness, right? In terms of weather, Jupiter in Aries is going to bring some wind, but especially heat, again, because Mars is going to be the ruler of Aries, and he is a hot and dry planet ruling a hot and dry sign. So we could have a very hot summer and early fall until Jupiter re-enters Pisces, basically. Obviously, fire risk will go way up this summer, especially after all those Jupiter and Pisces rains that we had will have caused vegetation to grow so very abundantly. So you've been warned. Now let's talk about Jupiter's direct and retrograde motion. Jupiter stations retrograde July 28th at 8 Aries, and will station direct about 4 months later on November 23rd at 28 Pisces. So in addition to the 3 dates when Jupiter changes signs, Jupiter's change of direction adds 2 more change points to circumstances in 2022. Now you see why I've described his journey this year as a winding road. So in case you haven't been keeping track, the sign changes and changes in direction chronologically are May 10th, July 28th, October 27th, November 23rd, and December 20th. Note that 3 of these dates are in the last 3 months of the year, so I think that back and forth that I referred to in the 4th quarter is going to come from a lot of these directional and sign changes of Jupiter. It's going to be hard, I think, making firm plans at a national or global level for this period as well as personally. So again, it's important to stay flexible and recognize that your plans may change several times. Generally, when Jupiter turns retrograde, events move more slowly and they regain momentum as he turns direct. So between July 28th and November 23rd, we may feel as if we are perpetually behind where we want to be, and it's hard to get that necessary momentum to move forward. The advice is to move forward and make progress as best as you can while being patient and recognizing that things will speed up eventually. On a collective level as well, this 4-month period can feel like a lull, even though things can still change during this period, because don't forget that during the retrograde period, Jupiter is going to change signs. So it's still going to feel like, yes, things have changed, but not everybody will have gotten the memo. And so there could be a feeling of disconnect between the change that we might be perceiving, but maybe others don't see it at all. And it won't be until Jupiter turns direct that they start to perceive that, oh, maybe things are different now. Now, there are going to be some major aspects involving Jupiter in 2022. Chronologically, the Sun will conjoin Jupiter March 5th at 15 Pisces. And this is an important aspect because it represents the simultaneous end and beginning of the new Jupiter synodic cycle. It can make Jupiter's change into Pisces that was over 2 months ago feel a little bit more real. We start seeing what Jupiter in Pisces is all about. It sort of becomes its own entity, and it's kind of like, oh, that's what this is going to be. The last time this happened in 2010, the Sun conjoined Jupiter, and this triggered an 8.8 magnitude earthquake in Chile, accompanied by a tsunami, which is very appropriate for Pisces, given that Pisces is a water sign. Now, several hundred people died, so it was certainly a tragedy, but of course it could have been far worse, especially if it had happened in like a very densely populated metropolitan area, which was not the case. So maybe Jupiter had some protective influence even over this really dramatic earthquake situation. In general, this conjunction brings the opportunity for a new era and a bold new direction, whether in our personal or our collective life. I wouldn't be surprised if we heard about new political or other initiatives at this time. Certainly in political matters, this Sun-Jupiter conjunction brings an opportunity for new deals and peace agreements. I always say it's an opportunity because people don't often take it. People love to fight. However, in many cases, very important peace treaties have been signed around the Sun-Jupiter conjunction. Conflicts can end pursuant to this aspect, assuming that all parties are at least reasonably willing to sit at the table. Now, Jupiter will conjoin Neptune April 12th at 24 Pisces, and among the planetary aspects, strictly speaking, I think that this is the most important one in 2022. Both planets are superior planets, and this is a rare combination. It impacts the collective primarily, and if you saw my Patreon video about the markets in 2022, this combination is extremely important for the markets. Politically, I think that this augurs a new phase. And this phase is especially focused on benefiting everyone. It's a very generous, idealistic kind of feeling, and it seeks to uplift people. Certainly this combination in Aquarius had been linked to a financial rescue packages or even larger long-term movements and the like, as we saw in 2009, the last time this conjunction occurred. Now, Venus will conjoin Jupiter April 30th at 28 Pisces, and this is a lesser aspect because Venus is an inferior planet, but it's still worth mentioning because it will participate in that separating Jupiter-Neptune conjunction that perfected earlier in April. There is an opportunity in April and early May for a beautiful harmonizing gesture of peace and reconciliation. As with all benefic planetary combinations, Venus conjunct Jupiter carries a lot of positive potential that we can embrace personally and as a society if only we want to. Obviously, it's not always easy to get everyone on the same page, but just know that there is this window that's going to be open that could be used extremely constructively this spring. Now, Mars will conjoin Jupiter May 29th at 3 Aries, and this is a combination that can liberate from war as well as previous warlike acts. So just as an example, in 1975, Mars conjoined Jupiter in Aries, and right around that time, Greece emerged from their 7-year military dictatorship, and they turned into a more normal, sort of publicly directed country rather than a military directed one. Just prior to that same conjunction, the Suez Canal finally reopened after many years following the Six-Day War in the Middle East. And then in 2011, Osama bin Laden was killed by forces on the last Mars-Jupiter conjunction in Aries. So actions that are both military and intended to be judicial or restorative can happen around that Mars-Jupiter conjunction. Sometimes this combination also brings a reconciliation or truth-finding commission or committee following military or paramilitary atrocities. It can also lead to things like killer thunderstorms and tornadoes, so be aware. Now, the triple Mercury-Jupiter opposition on September 9th at 6 Aries, September 18th at 4 Aries, and October 12th at 1 Aries is also important because of its triple nature. Now, we also had a triple opposition between Mercury in Libra and Jupiter in Aries in September and October 1975. This combination proved somewhat violent with explosions and one of 2 assassination attempts on Gerald Ford. However, it also led to Spanish dictator Francisco Franco stepping down for health reasons and paving the way for Spain to emerge from decades of military rule. I think you're starting to see a theme here, with Jupiter bringing liberation from military figures and regimes. Note that Jupiter in Aries in Franco's case represents again that powerful military figure opposed by medical realities symbolized by Mercury. So these aspects, as they go from Pisces and then shift to Aries later in the year, show the difference in emphasis that Jupiter's change of sign brings. It changes from large collective events concerning people's well-being, as signified by Jupiter in Pisces, to strongly military-focused activities or people emphasized by Jupiter in Aries. It's very different, and it tends to bring a bit of a whiplash effect going from one to the other. So again, we're going to see kind of a very dual year in many ways. Jupiter brings liberation wherever he transits. And in Pisces, the liberation is often psychological or spiritual. It tends to be subtle, although sometimes financial as well, in keeping with Jupiter in his own sign, as he is the predominant universal ruler of money. Now in Aries, the liberation again is more from military figures or military oppression or from the horrors of war, again like Franco or from the military dictatorships in general, as in Greece. Now Jupiter's synodic cycle, which again is the ongoing cycle between Jupiter and the Sun, I already alluded to the start of the new cycle when Sun conjoined Jupiter in March 5th at 15 Pisces. But this is actually just one snapshot in a longer process that starts when Jupiter goes under the sunbeams and becomes invisible due to the Sun's glare, is then conjoined by the Sun, and then finally emerges from the Sun's beams on the other side as their conjunction fully separates. In 2022, Jupiter will set under the beams on February 20th, and then he emerges from the beams March 18th. Approximately 1 month that Jupiter is going to be invisible is that really crucial period. It's really a time when the significations of any planet that's under the beams undergo retooling, they're under construction, or they're closed for maintenance, if you will. It's not a strong period for Jupiter, but it's very necessary. And so when he emerges March 18th, that's a very powerful moment for him. It's kind of like being released from prison. So liberation and empowerment have a very powerful moment, a very historic moment even. And I'm hopeful that this period is a strong turning point in the pandemic toward health and wholeness and some perhaps psychological peace for a lot of people as well. Finally, we'll talk a little bit about the eclipses of 2022, and I wanted to focus on the eclipse of April 30th. I think that this is the one that's going to be the most interesting in many ways. It is in Taurus, and the ruler of the eclipse is going to be Venus. What's interesting here is that Venus will conjoin Jupiter in Pisces. It's hard to speculate what this means exactly, but eclipses always bring drama. Whatever they do, it's always big. It may not be lasting. In fact, it often isn't, but it does tend to be very wow. So often it is negative, but here, because of the strong benefic influences, at least the potential exists for a grand gesture of liberation and compassion and kindness. Remember that eclipses tend to work most effectively on the collective and also on people who are pivotal in the course of events like heads of state and so on. Eclipses tend to be much more impactful there compared to individual lives. So you can see that there are going to be some very important individual gestures with some of these aspects in eclipses. But overall, this is going to be a year that's going to be marked by fairly significant and rapid changes of focus. In the United States, of course, we're going to have the midterm elections in early November 2022, and I'm sure that's one of the reasons we're seeing so much activity in that fourth quarter. There are a number of very important political races, and so a lot of people are going to be watching very carefully, and I'm sure there's going to be a fair amount of drama and attention and maybe even some cliffhangers related to these elections. All right. Thanks for watching. I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel.